My wife found something strange while we were camping, and she refuses to put it down. Written and guest narrated by JamFranz. Apologies in advance for any typos or grammatical errors. I am typing this on my phone with my non-dominant hand. Everything happened so recently, it's still so vivid in my mind. My wife, Fallon, had never been camping before, and we decided to go together for our 5-year wedding anniversary. It probably doesn't sound like the most glorious vacation, but we love the outdoors, and we figured it'd be a great break from our desk jobs. The first couple of days we hiked, watched the stars, and relaxed together. We live in the middle of the city, so we enjoyed seeing the tall blue spruces, the mountains, and smelling the fresh air. It was the perfect trip. At first. Things started to go downhill today, the day before we planned on leaving. We decided to start our hike on a trail we had walked before and immensely enjoyed, planning to choose a different fork this time. We were taking in the sights. We had started discussing moving out of the city so we could do things like this more often. We both worked from home, so it was a very real possibility, and we were engrossed in our conversation on the logistics of such a thing that it took us about 20 minutes to realize we hadn't hit the fork in the trail yet. That didn't seem right, so I pulled up the map, which indicated that we should have already passed that hard-to-miss Y shape. It had been a couple of days since our first trek on that trail, so we figured we just got disoriented and ended up on a different one. It was a pleasant walk and seemed straightforward enough, so we figured we'd keep going and that at least we could easily find our way back. We kept going, enjoying the soft breeze and the smell of pines it brought with it. We walked on in silence, listening to the rustling of the wind in the trees and occasional sound of small animals stepping through the brush. We heard the rushing water of the stream before we saw it. It wasn't very wide, less than 4 feet, but the way the water moved, I guessed it was far deeper than it looked. I tossed a small twig in out of curiosity, which was whisked away quickly. Fallon nudged me, pointing out that this stream didn't show up on the map at all. We wondered if we had accidentally left the boundaries of the park. The trail looked well worn and safe, and it wasn't as if we were wandering off into uncharted wilderness, so we decided to continue on and just hoped we weren't trespassing. Due to the width of the stream, I just stepped over and put my hand out to help Fallon, but by the time I turned to where she had been standing, she had already cleared the distance in a graceful jump. "Show off," I teased. She stuck her tongue out at me. Fallon seemed fascinated by the sudden change in our surroundings once we'd crossed over, while I was unnerved by the new look the forest had taken on. The trees were older, tall, gnarled, and as their density and height increased, the amount of light seeping in through the canopy decreased drastically. Still, the trail continued on. The soft black dirt sank slightly as we walked. The smell of something sour had replaced the fresh scent of pine. I don't remember when the silence began. Was it after the stream or before? I only noticed it when a light mist set in and Fallon disappeared. I jumped. She had snuck behind me and whispered in my ear,
"This would be the perfect setting for something to pop out of the woods and drag us away screaming."
I laughed, my fear a bit at the ridiculousness of the idea. Yeah, that would make for one hell of an anniversary. It was only after we stopped speaking and the silence returned in stark contrast that I realized we hadn't heard a single sound other than our own steps and breaths in a while. The silence from the forest seemed to confirm the sense of emptiness around us. We eventually came to an area where the trees and grass abruptly ended, framing a small lake. The abrupt difference in light between the dark, shadowy forest and the bright clearing had us blinking at the sudden return of the sun. The lake looked more like a crater in the black soil than water, until a gentle breeze created waves across its dark surface. Oddly, despite the brightness of the sun, there was no reflection. Fallon, who was terrified of deep water, inhaled sharply, stepping backwards instinctively. I hadn't seen anything like it before and wanted to take a picture. I found it fascinating. There weren't any footprints, human or otherwise, in the soft, dark dirt besides our own. I pulled out my phone and immediately dropped it on the ground. In the brief amount of time it took for me to bend down to retrieve it, wipe the black soil off the screen and lens, and stand back up, something in the atmosphere had shifted. The air was colder. The sun had been swallowed up in clouds in such a way that what little light shone through had taken on a sickly greenish cast. The water was moving. Ripples emanated from the middle as if something disrupted the otherwise calm water. It took a moment to realize that whatever the source of the disturbance was, it was beginning to emerge from the surface. Something about the wrongness of it told me that we should not stick around to see what it was. I backed away. My mouth was set in a grim line as I turned around to see if Fallon was seeing the same thing and I wasn't imagining it. She was focused on the lake as well, but with an expression I couldn't quite place at the time. Looking back now, I think adoration describes it best. Something almost human-shaped, but with long and spindly appendages, was arising from the water. The thing was matte black and difficult to distinguish from its surroundings in the low light, until it hauled itself further and began to pull itself towards us along the ground. I didn't know what it was, but my prey instincts told me I did not want to be here when it fully emerged, to find out. The non-rightness of it had my skin crawling. I reached for Fallon's hand, but it slipped through my fingers. She was jogging towards it before I even realized what was happening. And then, my wife did something that shocked me. She reached down, helped it the remaining way out of the water and to its feet. She began talking to it quickly, excitedly, and leading it towards me. My brain was still trying to process that turn of events. I wasn't entirely sure what I was witnessing. If I had been alone, I would have bolted in the opposite direction, but I couldn't leave my wife with that thing. I stood frozen in place, poised to dart forward and grab her away from it, but Fallon had draped one of its long, thin appendages over her shoulder. She approached me, holding it as if it were an injured hiking partner.
Jordan,
She said, her eyes misty.
this is my roommate Katie, from college.
She patted it on what would have been an arm had it been entirely human-shaped.
Katie, it has been so long.
She gestured towards me.
This is my husband, Jordan.
I stood there dumbfounded. I was frozen, my stomach heavy with a sort of fear I can't even find the words to describe, other than the feeling of seeing something human eyes were not meant to see. I know you don't need me to tell you this, but I just want to confirm to you that there was no way in hell that this thing was Katie. I had met Katie before, and she was an actual, living, breathing, normal human being. We were even friends on Instagram. According to her recently posted pictures, she was living on Cape Cod, not at the bottom of a lake in the middle of nowhere, several states away. When my brain and mouth finally started working again, all I could bring myself to say was, honey, I don't think that's... But before I could even think of how to finish that sentence, I noticed that where the thing had rested upon her shoulder, the delineation of where her body ended and its began seemed less crisp, somehow. I hoped it was a trick of the light, but the observation stirred me out of my stupor. I became more insistent. Fallon, I need you to get away from that, please. I don't know what you're seeing, but that isn't Katie, I said as calmly as I could. I thought that maybe if I reasoned with her, it'd snap her out of whatever delusion she was trapped in. Please, remember where we are. Why would she be out here? Why would she crawl out of that lake? She looked at me, indignant.
You want me to leave her here on her own? Injured?
I had to rack my brain for a bit, but then I did recall a story about how Katie had injured her leg in what would be the first and last time the two of them went skiing. Fallon had to nearly drag her back to the lodge. This had been years and years ago, long before we were even dating. I wondered frantically if she was reliving that moment. I didn't know what to do. She was latched onto that thing like it was her best friend, literally. She looked at me with that fiery determination in her grey eyes that told me there was no convincing her. "All right," I eventually said, wearily. It hadn't attacked her, or really moved at all since it emerged, and I wanted to get us away from that lake as soon as possible before anything else crawled out of it. I didn't really see any choice but to continue back the way we came. I led us back along the path, the surrounding woods silent enough that I could hear the raspy, rattling sound of the thing's gasping breaths. Every time I glanced over my shoulder, it became harder to tell where Fallon's arm ended and that matte black torso began. I picked up my pace. She was having a one-sided conversation with it about a different friend, laughing hysterically as if it had told her a joke. When she caught me staring, she narrowed her eyes at me in response. I squinted as if it had helped me understand what she was seeing, how to help her. But I couldn't. I stepped across the rushing water, same as before. I turned to Fallon, unsure what to do. Against my better judgment, I held out my hand. "I'll get Katie across, so you can jump," I whispered. She ignored me and instead continued on, putting one foot into the stream as if she hadn't seen it there at all. And it seemed to surprise her, because she jolted back before she could have put her full weight on it and fallen in. She stumbled backwards, as if surprised, shook her head like she was desperately trying to awaken from a daydream.
What?
Her annoyed look had instantly changed to one of confusion.
What's happening? How did we get back here already? Where's Katie?
The confusion quickly gave way to fear. The blood drained from her face. She had turned her head and seemed to be seeing the thing draped over her shoulder for what it truly was now. She was just now experiencing the primal terror I had felt when I first saw it emerge from the water. She tried to push it off her violently, panicking, struggling, screaming, shattering the silence.
I can't get it off.
Her eyes pleaded with me. I jumped back over to help.
Jordan, please.
She begged, her voice hoarse. I tried to help pull it off her, but wherever she had touched it, it almost seemed like it had absorbed her into its own body. My breathing was frantic. I was trying to tell her it would be okay, telling her to stay calm, while clearly not doing so myself. After unsuccessfully fumbling, she suddenly started moving away from me, her eyes full of confusion and fear. The thing, now that it was attached to her fully, had begun to back away from me and was slowly dragging her with it. Our eyes met as we simultaneously realized where it was taking her. It was heading back towards that dark, placid lake, back to where it had first emerged from. I grabbed her hand, pulling her towards me, putting all of my weight into it.
Please, Jordan.
She sobbed, her voice cracked.
Please don't let it take me.
For as thin and fragile as it looked, it was still managing to pull her away from me. Suddenly, the thing relented a bit, and without resistance, I fell back into the stream. All three of us were yanked in by the force of my fall and the current. I watched helplessly as she struggled to stay above the water. I'll never forget the look on her face, one of abject terror, as the thing pulled her close and she was swept away. When I finally caught on to something along the shore, I managed to pull myself out. I was coughing up water. I wasn't sure where I was. My clothes and everything else that hadn't been in our waterproof bag were soaked. The maps were gone, but my first thought was Fallon. I ran, screaming her name as dusk began to settle. Somehow, I found her. She was sitting against a tree, hugging herself, her skin pale from the icy water and eyes wide with shock. But to my immense relief, she was alive, and that awful thing was gone. She looked like her normal self, albeit traumatized a bit. I grabbed her hand, told her that we were okay, that everything was going to be okay. We were both going to make it. We agreed to leave right away and come back for our gear later. We did not want to risk meeting that thing or anything else like it while wandering around in the dying light trying to find our campsite. We sprinted back towards the car and had almost reached the lot too before she stopped short. It's funny, for a while I really did believe we were going to make it, even when she turned sharply, led us back the way we'd come. At first, I'd never felt more relieved to hold her hand in mine. But the thing is, now that she's pulling me back through the dark and dense trees, dragging me along the soft soil, I've realized that I can't let go of it. I just want to thank JamFranz for allowing me to narrate that story and also joining me as a guest narrator on this story. Make sure you leave some comments below to let her know what a great job she did, both in writing this story and also in narrating it. If you're new here, please consider subscribing, and as always, stay tuned for one more nightmare.